Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So today I'm going to do something a little bit different. Today I'm going to look at what a healthy entertainment industry actually looks like. Now I'm going to do so through comics, but first of all, I would say this can be taken for, I think, any entertainment industry. And secondly, I'm going to use as my example an individual that has, I would say, massive effect on the entertainment industry, at the very least, science fiction and fantasy entertainment that you consume today. And I'm going to do so for a number of reasons. First, because I do something called a 10-second comic review on the community section of my YouTube channel. And I have two listings for a rating. Listing number one is rating in a healthy industry, and number two is rating in today's industry. And a lot of people ask me, what's the difference? Well, I'm going to now point towards this video as the difference. And secondly, I'm doing it because there's a lot of people who listen to me and who read comics and who are consuming a lot of entertainment and getting bored with it right now, who have never actually lived through a healthy entertainment industry. If you were born in the last 20 years, you don't have any experience of a real healthy entertainment industry. More specifically, not a healthy science fiction and fantasy industry, and not a healthy comic industry. And thirdly, and the main reason I want to do this, is because this is information that needs to be gone over. We need to understand that a healthy industry can be there. It is possible. But before I do any of that, I just want to let everyone know that my graphic novel, Thomas Valiant, is still available on Indiegogo. You're looking at some of the beautiful art for my graphic novel in the background. And what I have done in trying to create my graphic novel, I went back to that healthy industry and I said, what actually works? What is a good story? What draws people to this medium? What do people want? How will this sell? And I put all that into the effort behind a story of a man trying to be a true traditional hero. So if any of that sounds appealing to you at all, you might want to click on that link in the description and go on over and see if my graphic novel is for you. So this is probably going to be a long video, but I think that's okay because the information I am going to go over is quite relevant right down to every letter. What I have come across is an interview that was done, I think, 2 weeks ago. It is now, I think, the 2nd of October, 2021. It was an interview done at the Cincinnati Comic Expo 2021 with Jim Shooter. Now, first off, if you don't know who Jim Shooter is, let me just say that if you enjoy any Marvel product at all, whether it be the MCU, whether it be television shows, whether it be comic books, whether it be console gaming that are based upon those characters, you have Jim Shooter to thank just as much as you would thank Stan Lee. And quite honestly, if there was a Stan Lee for DC Comics, the same would be applicable. Jim Shooter took Marvel Comics, which was telling good stories, but in a haphazard way, and he turned it into a well-oiled storytelling machine. And almost every one of these stories that you see on the big screen right now came under Jim Shooter's watch. He's the one that helped create all of these stories and shaped good stories and good storytelling into great stories and great storytelling. And just to give you some background on the man before I get into the interview itself, he has worked in the comic industry since 1955. He started when he was 13 years old, writing stories for DC Comics. I believe his first stories were in Superboy and the Legion of Superheroes. DC at the time thought he was a college student, that's why they hired him, but he was 13 years old. And when he wasn't even in high school, he came up with the first stories of things like Superman and the Flash having a race. He was the first one to ever tell that story. And when he speaks in this little interview panel that he's doing, he just mentions so many people in the comic industry, comic greats, and talks about them as friends and co-workers. People like John Byrne, Gil Kane, Wally Wood, Walter and Louise Simonson, Ann Nesenti, John Romita, Roger Stern, Chris Claremont, John Buscema, Denny O'Neil, Mike Zeck, Larry Hama, Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, Frank Miller. These are his contemporaries. These are his friends. These are his co-workers. Also, before I start, I just want to say the link is in the description for the original YouTube video where I found this. Now, I'm not going to use that myself. I've actually transcribed what I want to talk about because number one, I don't want to rip off someone else's YouTube video. And number two, the sound quality is so poor that it's extremely hard to hear at places. But I would suggest if you're interested in Jim Shooter, go on over there and listen to the entire thing. It is worth it. It is 50 minutes of him talking uncensored just about his experience since 1955 in the comic industry. Although I have to say, from the channel that I found it on, I don't think the person who runs the channel has anything to do with Comicsgate, so do what you will with that information. Number two, I just want to say that I am going to interrupt some of this and talk about some of the things that I have covered in my videos as a counterpoint to what Jim Shooter is talking about. Because Jim Shooter is talking about a healthy comic industry, a healthy entertainment product. And I have gone over many of videos where they have talked about the exact opposite. So I'm going to try to point out a couple of those, but I'll insert as little as possible as that, and I will point towards older videos that I have done. And again, I will link those in the description if you want to go look for the sources of what I'm talking about. And the last thing that I want to point out is this is a video of a man sitting on a stage with no pomp or circumstance whatsoever. He looks to be in a small little room talking to a handful of people, so much so that he can hear them, each one of them, that are in front of him. He has no microphone, sitting next to a bunch of chairs in a small room. And this is how one of the comic greats is being treated right now. Whereas the last Comic-Con stuff that I covered was a bunch of panels of people who now work for Marvel on a giant stage, talking to a giant audience about ridiculous things. Oh, and one other thing that I want to point out. I have absolutely zero idea of what the politics of Jim Shooter actually are. Quite possibly, he might hate my guts if he got to know who I was or had any idea, and that might be based upon the political, although I doubt he is such a person. But my point being that it does not matter. I don't need to know one thing about his politics. He is a great storyteller. And after reading so many of his stories and so many of the stories that he has helped shape, I still have no idea about his politics, and that's the way it should be. So this panel was supposed to be about the history of Marvel, but really, he's just talking about his experience within comics, again, since 1955. And he makes very little reference to the modern comic industry, except for one small thing at the first and one small thing at the end. At the first, he says that he still has friends in the biz and that sometimes they send him things to read. He doesn't read a whole lot, but he reads what people send him. And he says the following. He says, sometimes it's like, oh, you gotta read this. Sometimes it's, you can't believe what you're reading in this. And quite honestly, the way that he said that, I would take it as the first one to be extremely good. The second thing he said, you won't believe that this actually got published. But let's move into actual questions that he was asked. He was asked, if you want to get into comics, where do you start? And here was his answer. It's very hard these days. The big companies don't look at submissions. So your choices are, there are two things that will cause them to become aware of you. One is exposure, and the other one is success. So if you're self-published and it starts to take off a little bit, then they want to hear from you. You get exposure or you have success, and then you have a story to tell, and then they want to talk to you. Because no one at the big publishers is ever going to get fired for hiring a John Byrne, but they might fire you if you don't work out. You know, they all want to keep their phony baloney jobs, and also they're risk averse. So I just want to point out from this statement, how does he say you can get into the comic industry? Well, you put yourself out there into the world and you get either exposure or success, and that's how you get in. Now, I want to contrast that with what has been said at the major Marvel panels, the Women of Marvel panels at the Comic-Cons for the last number of years. How do they say that you can get into Marvel to actually work in comics? Because this is one of the questions they answer every year. What their answer is similar, but vastly different in the end. Their answer is, you need to put yourself out into the world, and then we will come and find you. Now, that's the same thing that Jim Shooter just said, but why would they come and find you? Well, New Marvel says, we will come and find you if you have a unique voice. And what does unique voice mean? Well, unique voice means that you have some intersectional quality with either your race or your religion or some other identity marker that makes sure that you're different from everyone else in the room. Now, Jim Shooter says you need to have exposure or success. Then they contact you, and then you have to have a good story to tell, and then they should hire you. But no, what they do at Modern Marvel is you need to have a unique voice. Literally, on one of the podcasts of Sana Amanat, the former second-in-command at Marvel Comics, she offered a job to a 16-year-old girl who had never written anything before in her life because she was a Native American environmentalist. Oh, and I forgot to mention that at one of those panels, those Marvel panels, they also said, and don't say anything bad about Marvel on your social media. And I think it was Margaret Stoll who said that, but I'm sure that actually has some relevance into what they're going to look at in order to see if they want you to work in comics. Now, the second thing I want to talk about, it's a very big and long quote, which I'm going to go over the entire thing, but every last part of it is extremely important. Jim Shooter starts talking about the death of Phoenix Saga, which is one of the iconic books within the history of Marvel. He starts off by saying, if I had a good writer and a good editor, I didn't worry about them that much. Talking about the story, he says, I just read it before it was sent off to the printers. I had to sign them out to go to print. Now, first off, I want to point out the confidence that this editor-in-chief must have had with the people he was working with in order for this to be the process before things went to print. And there's no wonder, because he's talking about teams like John Byrne and Chris Claremont. So, about the Phoenix Saga, he starts by talking about the story itself, talking about how Phoenix, Jean Grey, blows up a starship, and then later blows up an entire planet and kills all the people on that planet. And then he says the following, so I went to the editor and said, what do you have for the rest of the story? And the editor at that time was Louise, and she said, I have some work in progress for 2 issues, and I have the plot for the last. They didn't even write it yet. So I said, okay, let me see. So I read the issues, and it got more and more intense, building to an incredible climax. And then the plot of the last issue, Chris had the Shire capture Jean. And then he corrects himself and says, Phoenix. Somehow they put her in this machine that kind of fixes what's wrong in her mind. You know, makes her a good person again. And then they let her go. She goes back to Westchester and she's an X-Men and lives happily ever after. And I said, Chris, you don't just blow up a planet and say, oh, I feel better now. It's okay. You know, there's going to be some repercussions. You don't just blow up a starship. What about the families of the people who were on that starship? They'd be a little peeved. You know, they wouldn't say, oh, she's okay now. No. He said, you know, you have some kind of moral imperative here. I said, no, it's a bad ending for a great story. And I don't understand what he says next. He says, and the end, he just coughs up blood. This is stupid. So he bargains with me for a while and then said, well, what do you want? I said, well, you know, there has to be some consequences. There has to be something at stake, and there's a consequence. I said, you know, maybe she goes to intergalactic prison or something. He said, no, the X-Men would just keep trying to save her. I said, baloney, not on my watch, pal. But okay, it's your turn. You don't like that? You come up with something. The next morning, he stands in the door of my office and says, I'm gonna kill her. And I said, deal. I said, you do that right, and that will be a great ending. And he said to me, what do you mean? You can't kill her. I said, I'm not killing her. You're killing her. So we get in a stupid reverse argument, and then he runs out. And about 10 seconds later, the phone rings, and it's John Byrne calling me from Canada. He said the first words, are you out of your mind? I said, no. I made a deal with Chris. Now get to work. So then they were kind of stuck with it. But they knocked it out of the park, didn't they? I mean, what a book. Did you read that book? Holy cow. And they redeemed her in the end a little bit? Wow. I mean, sales of that book took X-Men from the middle of the pack to the top of the industry, where it stayed for 20 years. Okay, so I just want to go over a little bit of this. The fact that he, as the editor-in-chief, is saying, look, there has to be consequences to people's actions in order for it to be a good story. is such a refreshing thing to hear from someone who actually worked on comics. Because if you look at the comic industry today, all you get is story after story after story where there is no consequence to the actions of the individuals, the quote-unquote heroes that you're actually reading. And Chris Claremont actually argues with him and says, you have some kind of moral imperative that you're trying to stick in here. And he says, literally, twice, once emphatically, no, this is not what is happening at all. You're telling a good story with a bad ending. Why is it a bad ending? Because this is not how things would play out, quite simply. And this is what I'm always talking about, the idea that a story is a reflection of reality. This is exactly what Jim Shooter is talking about as well. He's saying, if this were to actually happen in the real world, people would not just say, oh, okay, she's better now. No, there would be consequences. That's how reality works. That's how human beings work. And you have to actually factor that in if you want to tell a good story. And one other thing about this moral imperative that Chris Claremont is claiming that Jim Shooter is sticking into the story. Jim Shooter says, no, I'm trying to tell a good story. But I just want to reference one of the people who I would see as Jim Shooter's current equivalent at Marvel Comics, which would be Sina Amanat, the person who worked her way up from editor to become, as her title said, the Vice President of Content and Character Development. And I'm going to be referencing this person a lot. But she did an interview with Fast Company. And by the way, it's still on YouTube if you want to go look it up. Just pump in Fast Company and Sina Amanat, and it will pop up. You should watch the longer of the two. And I will put my video on that interview that I did several years ago in the description. But at the end of that interview, she quite clearly states that superheroes are for, and I quote, pushing positive ideas. Can you see the 180-degree turn of Marvel Comics during the time between Jim Shooter and Sina Amanat? Jim Shooter is saying, yes, there is some morality to being human, but no, I'm not giving you a moral imperative. This is not a command. I'm not saying you have to believe this. You have to do this. I'm saying a good story tells a human story, and a human story involves some kind of morality, or at the very least, some kind of consequence to your actions that may possibly point towards morality. That's just a part of being human. So put it in there. But Sina Amanat is saying, no, this is a command. You need to push positive ideas. And personally, I would say, no, if you're telling a good story, you don't need to push anything. It is part of human existence that we live according to some morals. But if you're pushing something, you're forcing it. It is a command. It is an imperative. And why would someone like Sina Amanat or current Marvel need to push their morality? Because it is something that isn't within the human being themselves. And a few other small things that I want to pull out of this. Number one, he is talking about a great story, and the way he describes a great story is that it gets more and more intense until it builds to a climax. This is the way a good story is told. But you're not going to get that in a lot of your entertainment today. Sina Amanat actually argued this point with Ann Nesenti in one of her podcasts, saying that, no, a comic doesn't have to be an escalation narrative. There doesn't have to be a climax. Why? Because they're not telling a good story. They simply want to feed you a message. Number two, can you tell by his language, saying, holy cow, that he actually enjoys this book? That he actually thinks this is a good story to be told. He talks about other stories during this interview and says they were really cool. This is what people are actually looking for. But again, this is not what you're going to get within modern entertainment. For one of the Marvel products, which was Miss Marvel, Marvel Rising, when they had Cort Lane and Sina Amanat doing an interview about the show, they clearly stated that, yeah, we have, as they said, the kicking of the butts part down, but that's really not the message. The message is, can you be a good friend? Can you sympathize with those around you? And number three, how does he describe this story as affecting the run of X-Men? He says, the sales for this book took it from the middle of the pack and put it at the top for 20 years. It is the sales that he sees as being the product of this great story. And again, this is not something you're going to see within modern entertainment. Once again, I covered a Comic-Con panel where Sana Amanat, the person who was the second in command at Marvel Comics just a couple of years ago, say, you can't just look at the sales numbers because, as she said after that, we might sell it sometime in a trade, where those trades can be sold to library or parent associations. But at the end of the day, her statement was, it doesn't really matter how much they sell. She quite literally was talking about America Chavez, a book that got canceled again and again and again. And she is saying they consider that as successful as their most successful book, which at the time was Avengers. So in her mind, in the current entertainment and certainly comic industry mind, sales do not equal success. But in a healthy comic industry, that is the earmark of what a successful story is going to do. And by the way, I'm just going over these questions as they come up. I'm not putting them in any specific order, just the order that they were in as they were asked to him. And the next question that was asked to him that I want to cover was, did a family member or a friend introduce you to comic books? And his answer was, when I was a kid, comics were everywhere. No one had to introduce me. They were in the supermarket. They were in every store you went into had a comic rack. They were everywhere. And I just wanted to read that because, quite honestly, that is the way I was introduced to comics as well. And that, again, is the earmark of a healthy comic, a healthy entertainment industry. It is everywhere. And why would it be everywhere? Because people buy it. And why do people buy it? Because they're good stories, because it's good entertainment. This is the process he describes over and over again. Good stories bring you good sales, bring you more exposure, bring you better sales, and everybody wins in the end. And what do you have in contrast to this today? You have comic creator after comic creator saying, don't buy my books. Just like Kelly Sue DeConnick in that video that's going around right now, where she says, if you don't like my politics, don't buy my books. You have comic pro after comic pro on social media blocking people and saying, go away. I don't want you to buy my books. These are all symptoms of a decaying and a dying industry. And then he was asked, is there anything you ever regretted doing and why? And his answer is, regret it? Well, listen, I made some dumb decisions. I made some bad judgments. I made mistakes. I think about them all the time. I will say this for me, though. It was never in self-interest. I didn't steal their money. I didn't sleep with their wife. I didn't kill their dog. I did what I thought my job was, to the best I could. And if I made a bad judgment or something, okay, that's my fault. I can give you a list. But mostly, just try to do the right thing. I thought my job was to make good comics. And that was what I cared about. And guys who did their jobs didn't have a problem with that. And guys who didn't do their jobs, I tried to work it out. And if it didn't work out, then they left. And again, I have to say, that is so refreshing to hear in 2021. First off, the humility of this man to actually take responsibility for his mistakes and being able to say, yes, I have made mistakes and I take responsibility for those mistakes. This is something which is sorely lacking today from almost every individual you're going to run across within not just entertainment, but within society at large. And I have to say, to my own shame, I am counted among those people at times. I wish I was as big a man as Jim Shooter, to be able to so freely say, yes, I've made mistakes. Yes, I take responsibility for those mistakes. But first off, I never did it out of self-interest. I did it because I thought this was my job, and my job was to sell comics. And I was doing the best that I could do. And not only that, but to say that those people with the work ethic around me to do the same, they didn't have a problem with it. And those people who didn't, well, I tried to work it out. It's not I fired them immediately. It was not I got rid of them as soon as I could. It's I gave them another chance. I tried to work it out with them. And if we couldn't work it out, then they left. Again, this is the sign of a healthy industry, a sign of a healthy working relationship, an industry where people can be honest, people can speak their minds, people work hard and do their best to do the job that they have in front of them to do. Now, the next thing that I want to touch on is when Jim Shooter is talking about that story that he wrote as a kid, which was the first race between the Flash and Superman. And it's a very small thing, but here's what he says. He said he wanted to make the Flash win because it's his only superpower, and so give the guy a break. But the editor of his book told him, no, it has to be a tie. And he asked, what? Why? And the editor said, because we don't want the Superman people to be disappointed, and we don't want the Flash people to be disappointed. Now, first of all, I have to break in and say, this is respect for your audience. But more respect even than that is shown by Jim Shooter. Because what was Jim Shooter's answer to all of this? His answer was, so I engineered the story to make it a tie. So that they made it a tie on purpose to thwart some villainous scheme. So his editor is telling him, look, this is what our readers want. We can't alienate any of our readers. And Jim Shooter, instead of throwing up his hands, instead of arguing, instead of putting it in there just because someone told him to do so, actually dug in his heels and started to work and then made it part of the story, made it part of the plot, and made it into a story point that actually sold books. And another small point that I want to cover is when someone asked Jim Shooter about how he worked when he was at Marvel, because he was the editor-in-chief. Did he handpick the people that he wanted to work with? And the humility of his answer is striking. He said, no, he thought that would be an abuse of his power. So when he decided to work on a book, he just picked the person who was going to be the editor, and the editor then would tell him what to do. He would take off his hat of being the editor-in-chief, and he would just be a writer. And whatever the editor told him to do, he would do it. Again, the immense humility of this man, as compared to the picture of the comic book industry and the so-called professionals that work in it today. People like Vida Ayala, who only get to write books and sell themselves as being queer and brown. That's all she describes herself as being. And so it's not good storytelling that she's selling. It's her intersectionality, and to some extent, it's her ego. And then someone asked him, what was the most underrated book you ever worked on? And his answer was Legion of Superheroes. But he says some important things here. Number one, he says, I wasn't doing this for fun. My family needed the money. I wanted to sell stories. And again, let me just reference a tweet from the current editor of the X-Men books, who has been there for a number of years now, saying, isn't money just the worst? And talking disparagingly about actually making money. Now, I'm sorry, but if I was the editor-in-chief and someone who was working for me said something like that, I would have to have a little bit of a discussion with them. Because if you're not there to make money, if you're not there to sell books, and your purpose for being at the company is to sell books, what in the world are you doing there? But Jim Shooter goes on, he says, I wasn't doing it for fun. My family needed the money. I wanted to sell the story. And it didn't do too bad. Again, talking about the Legion of Superheroes. He said his run on Legion of Superheroes stayed at the middle of the pack for comic sales. And you want to know what the middle of the pack for comic sales were for the Legion of Superheroes while Jim Shooter was writing this book? It was 500,000 copies sold every month. This was the middle of the pack. He goes on to talk about Superman, how Superman at that point was falling desperately in the ratings because Marvel was on the rise. And what was Superman selling? Well, he says when he began his run on the Legion of Superheroes, Superman was selling 1.2 million copies every month. And when he left the Legion of Superheroes, it had fallen to such a rate that it was about 400,000 every month. And that was almost in cancellation territory. Briefly, I have just hopped over to Comic-Con, which at present only gives you a rough number of how many comics were sold to comic shops for the month. You want to know what the #1 comic sales for July of this year was? It was X-Men #1 and Moon Knight #2 at 250,000. Less than 25,000. This is the current comic #1. And you go down to 3 and 4, it drops to 125,000. And you get to 9 and below, it is less than 100,000 copies sold. And when you get down to the middle of the pack, how many copies of a comic are being sold? Well, around 7,000 per month. As opposed to Jim Shooter's middle of the pack 500,000, where 400,000 was getting you close to cancellation territories. Can you see the massive difference between a healthy industry and what we have today? And by the way, I did a number of videos talking about the cancellation numbers for Marvel, doing some analysis about the books that were canceled to see what their cancellation number actually was, because they don't let you know, so I had to judge what it was by how many things were getting canceled. About 10 years ago, it was around 10,000 per month. The last time I actually got good numbers from Comic-Con, about 2 years ago, it was below 6,000. That is their new cancellation number. So from that question, Jim Shooter was asked, what was your favorite Legionnaire? And I love his answer, because his answer is Karate Kid, because he actually created the character of Karate Kid. And today, I'm sorry, but no one would create such a character, because they would see his powers as being cultural appropriation, because he looks like a white guy and his name is Karate Kid and his powers is karate. And the funny thing is that he created him. Why? Because he wanted to introduce to the Legion of Superheroes a more visual character. Because the whole point of the character in his mind was that he actually had some visual qualities that would play out on the page, as opposed to, as he says, pointy powers, where someone just pointed at a thing and it got lighter, or they pointed at a thing and lightning bolts shot from their fingers. He wanted a more visual experience for his audience. And again, what massive respect for his audience this man has. And that's only the tip of the iceberg. He was asked the next question, were any characters more difficult to write than others? And he answers, yes. Some characters require some specific knowledge. For instance, I had to do a lot of reading about karate. At first, it was difficult. Also, I don't know how long it would take me to write a G.I. Joe with all the technical stuff in there, or an issue of Nam, because it had to be right. So yeah, some of those were hard. Now he continues on, and I'm going to get to that. But again, can you see the massive respect that this person has for the story that he is writing? He has to get it right. He's selling books like Nam or G.I. Joe to people who actually went to Nam, to people who are actually in the military. So he had to get it right. He had to sit down and read technical manuals. When he's writing about someone who uses karate, he actually had to read a whole lot of information about karate. This is how a story is written. And what do we have today? Well, I did a video about Sina Grace. Sina Grace being the writer of Iceman for a number of years. And how did he create the character? Well, he didn't have any idea of what to do with the character. They gave him 3 different tries at the character and the book, which was canceled 3 times. And even on the verge of cancellation that 3rd time, he did a podcast with Marvel saying he didn't even know how Iceman's powers worked. So on the one hand, you have a person who doesn't even do the most fundamental research into the character to find out how the character works. And on the other hand, you have Jim Shooter, who goes through technical manuals in order to write a G.I. Joe story. So he goes on to say, so yeah, some of those were hard. Some people say that Superman is really hard to write. Now, I grant you, it's a little more difficult when the guy's that super. Most writers, their trick is, well, the way they approach it is that they depower him, and they don't like the Boy Scout aspect of him, so they make him petulant, and vengeful, and jealous, and violent. And that's not Superman. No, he's Sir Galahad. Is it tough to write stories about Sir Galahad? Maybe it is, but that just means you need a better writer. You need someone who can get into that mindset. There are plenty of ways to challenge Superman that didn't require making him weak or inventing kryptonite or something. So you might say that it was harder, but I'd say, how hard are you willing to work? If you're willing to put the work into it, you'll have fun. And then as an afterthought, he says, I also did a lot of reading in science, a good, solid science base. And again, I don't even think I have to point this out, but this is exactly what you see everywhere around you today. Take a look at Zack Snyder and the versions that DC is giving you on the screen of Superman, of Batman, of the Justice League. They are, as Jim Shooter says here, petulant, vengeful, jealous, violent. That's not who these heroes are. And the reason why they write them this way is because they don't want to put the work into actually writing the characters as they are, as they should be. And I love that line he says right here. Is it tough to write stories about Sir Galahad? maybe it is, but that just means you need a better writer. So the next thing he starts to talk about is his role in beginning the giant event stories for Marvel and DC. So he starts to talk about Secret Wars and how one of the big toy companies wanted to make DC superhero toys. And so Mattel wanted to compete with that. So they went to Marvel and decided they're going to make Marvel superhero toys, but no one actually knew who the Marvel heroes were except for people who read comics. Therefore, they wanted to have a big event in order to bring up their profile so that they could sell the toys. And Shooter here talks about the executives at Marvel that he actually had to deal with in order to get this rolling. And he said those executives had no idea what a comic book was. He says at one point, they never actually opened a comic book. They had no idea who the characters for Marvel were. One of them had no idea how many stories were actually in a comic book. She thought there were 4 or 5 stories in every issue. Another one, I think he said the president, didn't know how to actually read a comic book. And I point this out because I wouldn't say this is something that is shocking in any way. But right now, you have Marvel and you have DC, and the people who run the companies are pretty much the same way. And yet, you have Jim Shooter working with these people and actually producing a good product, actually dealing with a healthy industry. Whereas today, you don't see that. You can't blame it on the executives. It's not all their fault because they don't understand comics. As he shows with this little story itself, you can still have a healthy industry even if the higher-ups have no idea how any of this stuff works. And he goes on to talk about the difference between Marvel and DC characters and tries to explain it to those higher-ups, talking about a Q score being how well the general public actually knows something. He says the Q score for the DC heroes was fairly high, but the Q score for the Marvel heroes was very low. Even for characters like Hulk and Spider-Man who had been on television, a lot of people did not know who they were. But the way that he sold everything to these executives was to tell them, even though they didn't have a high Q score, Marvel at that time was outselling DC 5-1. And again, it comes back to the numbers. It comes back to how many books can you sell? And when they went through the whole Secret Wars and they brought this publicity to the toy company that they wanted in order to sell the toys, what does Shooter talk about? He says the Marvel toy line outsold DC by a wide margin. Again, these are the results that he's looking for. And then he goes on to say the following, after talking about Secret Wars. He said, other people said, hey, that's a good idea. So everybody started doing crossovers. It became a big summer event for everyone. Usually, though, they didn't want to work as hard as we did. We worked like hell to make sure it was all in continuity. And again, all I have to do is to point to modern Marvel and the modern comic industry, and you get writers who have zero idea about what continuity actually is. They write stories that make zero sense, even with the continuity, even with the story that they wrote last issue, even with the first of the story 5 pages ago. So the next question he was asked was, is there anything you're working on? And he says that Image wants him to write a how-to book. And so help me, if he writes that book, I'm going to be in line to pick that up. But again, his humility shines through when he says the following. He says, I didn't invent anything, but I collected a lot of wisdom. I talked to all those guys, learned so much from those guys. I worked with Jack. I worked with Steve. I worked with Wally Wood, Gil Kane, Stan, so I paid attention to every word they said. And once again, I have to contrast with the fact that, look at the humility of this man, trying to soak up all the wisdom of the people that were around him at every point. And contrast that with the statement of Sana Amanat, who was brought on to Marvel Comics by Joe Quesada, who said he wanted her to create an entire new way of writing comics. He wanted an entirely new audience. And she told Joe Quesada that she didn't have the knowledge or experience to do that. And his answer was, that's exactly what we need. So what was he looking for? He was looking for someone who didn't have experience, someone who didn't know anything about making comics and use them as the template to create a new comic system. This is the exact opposite of gathering wisdom from those around you, from your elders, from the people who actually know how to do things. And so I want to finish up with something that Jim Shooter said at the end. And what does he talk about? Well, he talks about the current comic industry for a very short little period, and he says the following. There's not a lot of room in the comic field right now. There's, fewer books, and they don't pay. We had gotten to the point where, when I was around, guys were making really good money and making royalties and all that stuff. But nowadays, I asked, and I'm not sure the name that he actually says here, because again, the audio quality on this video is extremely poor. I think he says Rags Morales, but I'm really not sure. But he continues. I asked him what was his rate, and he told me. And he said, well, that's actually kind of a lot. He said, that's the rate it used to be. Now it's a third of that. They cut the rates. He says this with disbelief in his voice. He says, they cut the rates because they're not selling any books. That's not the way to sell more books. So again, I just want to point out, what is this man's criteria? This man who has been creating comics since he was 13 years old, who was working in the industry since 1955. He's saying a high tide rises all boats. He's saying that he and the people around him worked so hard to get the comic industry to a point where people were actually making good money, and then bonuses on top of that money. And what do we have now? We have people making a third of that. Again, I have to point to that Kelly Sudaconic video where she says, if you don't like my politics, don't buy my books. Well, I'm sorry, lady, but you know that when people stop buying your books, they also stop buying the book that the colorist worked on, or that the letterer worked on, or that the editor worked on, and they might not share your politics. You see how these current creators sabotage everyone around them. For what? For their politics. But in Jim Shooter's time, you needed to make good books. Why? Because you had to sell well. Why? Because everybody needed to feed their family. Everyone deserved a working wage. Everyone deserved to have a good job. And so everyone worked at it. Everyone put in the time. Everyone put in the effort to do so. And that's pretty much the end of the panel with Jim Shooter. Now, I know I usually end with a bang, but I'm just going to end up with one of the quotes from Jim Shooter that I have not used yet. And I think it sums up a lot of the mindset that he is expressing within all of the answers to the questions that he is giving. He says, I never believe anything until the check clears. All right, so I'll leave it there. Honestly, I think this is one of the most important videos I have ever done. So please, if you are at all interested, you might want to click on the link in the description to go over and see the actual interview itself. There is certainly more than I have covered. There is about 50 minutes of the man himself talking, and he is a spectacular wealth of information. So if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. And don't forget, my graphic novel, Thomas Valiant, the link for it is in the description. It is my attempt to take the great comic industry standards and to apply them to a true hero story. So if that sounds appealing to you, you might want to click on the link for my graphic novel in the description and go on over and see if my graphic novel is for you. All right, I'll leave it there. I'll see you later. Bye.